start by recording. This is the end of March, March 31st. And tomorrow is April Fool's Day. So everybody should have their plans ready. I was just thinking about April showers bring May flowers. So never mind. I think, so I went through recently and took a look at all the blogs, and I encourage everybody to go look at what each of everybody is doing, because they are public blogs. So Leah has done this really awesome, it wasn't Canva, Venngage infographic on inequities in racial inequities in income. Had you used Venngage before?
I used it once in Dr. Beaver's class, but that was probably the only time.
Yeah. So you're just using the free version?
Yes, ma'am.
So they're pretty amazing. And I've tried with Canva. And I mean, they make everything look good. So, and they're really fun to experiment with. So I encourage everybody to take a look at what everybody else is doing. So I want to keep talking about the classical structure, or the classical template as they talk about it in the book. Because today's the last day for talking about structure. On the homework, so today you were supposed to apply the ideas of structure to one of the blogs by today. I'm going to change that to Monday, just so people have more time to think about that. And then there is the quiz on structure, which will be available tomorrow morning or late tonight. We'll be starting on the next chapter next week, which is on style. And in many ways, rhetoric became thought of only as a question of style, really in the 18th and 19th century, and then it's had a rebirth in terms of more substantive stuff. But thinking about style is certainly an important part of rhetoric as well. So we'll be working with chapter 5 on style for the next 2 weeks. And then the last section is basically, this pink part is to focus on the project that you've decided to really finalize, and whether it's the rhetorical analysis or the opinion piece. And we'll basically just kind of do a traditional writing class, talking, sharing the documents and giving each other feedback and revising and finalizing. So are there any questions just about the schedule?
Thanks for the extension.
Yeah, no problem. You were not the only person who requested it or who said they needed it.
Well, thank
And
you.
there were several who obviously needed it since it wasn't there. And I'm behind on giving people feedback, so I tried to catch up on giving people feedback in the last couple of days.
The break was too short.
It was. I mean, I can't remember now what I did because I don't know. Anyway, so I also have a new plan for the quizzes. I've been in these webinars for continuing legal ed where they have it set up so that halfway, like a third of the way through, it stops and you have to answer a question. So they do these things to try to make you stay there at least the whole time and participate. I haven't figured out
Make
how
sure
to
you're
do
not
that,
sleeping.
but I did finally figure out a way to do something comparable. And that is that in class, from now on, there will be at least one point where I ask everybody a question and to do something. And then during the, in the quiz, I'll say to anybody who's not there, to do that themselves, to answer the question that we did in class. Now, you guys almost always are here, so you don't do the quizzes, but I am saying this for all the people who are listening later on. And that this is a way, because I've been finding that sometimes people just answer, I just ask these very general questions, and sometimes people just say something that happens in the first 5 minutes and then nothing else. And so I'm kind of like, I wonder if they've read or watched anything past the first 5 minutes. Now, one of the reasons that I think it's, I encourage everybody to watch past the first 5 minutes is that the quizzes rely on you having actually listened all the way through. So that also can motivate you, but you don't know what's going to be on the quiz, do you? So as I said, I just extended the deadline on this, on thinking about applying structure to one of the blogs. And what does that mean? Well, one of the things, if you're talking about your opinion piece, and to some extent, it could also apply to the rhetorical analysis. What I'm saying is rewrite it following one of the structures. Or you might take a look at what you've written and see, well, which one of these structures is closest to it? Am I sort of following a classical template? And if so, just try to just kind of tinker with it so that that's really clear of what you're doing. It could apply to the rhetorical analysis as well. You could definitely use, for example, the classical template to write a rhetorical analysis. You could have an introduction, exordium of some kind, and then some kind of background about whatever this piece is, and then a preview of what the point is that you're going to make, et cetera, et cetera. So you could definitely reorganize or, edit so that your structure is following one of these structures. The other way is in specifically with the rhetorical analysis is to make sure that you're thinking about how this thing is structured. And we're going to try to grapple with that today. So hopefully you'll get some ideas. If you're talking about oral speech, probably a lot of these things will apply easily. If you're talking about a video game or music, it might be a little different because it's you know, it's not the traditional kind of thing, but it's still going, it's still certainly something possible. So just as a remind you, we're focusing on this canon of arrangement. Not really sure what canon means in Greek and Latin, and why they call them canons. But basically they're categories of things that you need to learn about rhetoric. And the classical rhetoricians basically thought invention and arrangement were the most important topics. And clearly, we probably do in our current approaches to rhetoric as well. This overall idea of psychology of form by Kenneth Burke is kind of what's structuring all of the chapter and my thinking about organization as an arousing and fulfilling of desires. That is, that there is a process going on in the mind of the reader or the audience or the listener or the game player, whatever the audience is, and that the rhetor is somehow choosing what to organize by thinking about what's going on in the mind of the audience. So what that means always is that arrangement is always connected to the rhetorical situation. It's like you don't just arrange in a vacuum. And, you know, we as writing teachers make fun of the high school kind of arrangement template called the 3-part or 5-paragraph essay. You make an introduction, 3 supporting paragraphs, and a conclusion. And one of the reasons why we tend to make fun of it is it's so rhetorical. So yes, there may be a rhetorical situation in which it's appropriate to say, in a very blunt way, this is my point, here are 3 supporting points, and here's my conclusion. But that's just some rhetorical situations. And instead of thinking of, it's done as a way of teaching people to have a structure and think about structure. And that for that reason, it's valuable. But at the next step, you need to think about the choices that you can make because of your rhetorical situation. And in fact, Aristotle, when talking about arrangement, is always focused on which arguments should you use in which order for your audience. So the way he talks about it is always tied to the rhetorical situation. In other words, you're arranging in a way that will work best with the audience in this context, in this moment, for this purpose. What does the audience know? What does the audience believe? What does the audience understand? How, and you think about that and then think about how you're going to organize that. So, and that'll apply to anything with a game. When we talked a little bit, Micah had talked about a second series of a game that was real popular. Well, it's obvious that when they're thinking about designing the game, they have to think about both those who have played the first version of the game and then the second new improved version of the game. When thinking about distributing a song out, a musical album, when people decide to distribute it is part of the rhetorical situation, and it may affect what they choose. Let's say, you know, if you're talking about an album, one of the things to talk about with an album is, you know, what are the particular songs that are selected in an album? What is the order they're putting it in? And then, of course, you can also talk about structure within a song. And, you know, what is the sense of the singer's audience and how are they working with that? So I gave you a chart before that one way of thinking about how the psychology of form and organization is that, you know, you have a rhetorical situation that's when you start, and then you have a goal of a rhetorical situation when you finish. And so how do you organize in this arrow here? You know, how do you kind of move that audience from place A to place B? And the other diagram I showed was the give a new contract, which is really a linguistic concept, but I think it's extremely helpful in thinking about in terms of a overall rhetorical concept. And that is that the rhetorical situation is the given in any particular piece of rhetoric. And then when you introduce the beginning of something, it is now new, but it needs to connect somehow back to the given. Now, once something is introduced, it becomes the given for the next new thing. So an obvious thing is if you have a section in a piece of writing that says, I'm going to talk about A, B, and C, which might be the new at the introductory section, it then becomes the given for the next thing. And it also sets up expectations in the mind of the audience, which are obviously that you're going to talk about A, B, and C. If you don't talk about A, B, and C, that thwarts those expectations and can confuse the audience. But if you do talk about it, it helps the audience because, you know, you sort of triggered their little memory banks. And so they've got in their minds A, B, and C. And then as new information comes in, you're trying to sort of slot them into those three categories. It's particularly useful for that kind of thing in oral discourse. That's why if you've taken a speech class, they really emphasize having, you know, sort of forecasting statements, previewing statements that will help the audience sort of hang on to what's going on. And otherwise things will all just kind of mush together. So today I wanted to talk about another arrow, another movement. This is really from the beginning of the chapter where they talk about how you could see the sort of psychology of form as being a movement from absence to presence. And they use presence both in a literal sense, that is, something is actually present in the piece of rhetoric, but also they mean it in a more sort of, I don't know, more sort of visceral sense. That is that that you really pay attention to something and sort of get focused on something, and that's whatever the presence is the persuasive force. And you may have noticed that, and I know many of you have noticed because you're using the terminology of the presentational argument that they use a lot about. So they talk about you know, how there is sort of an ideational argument, sort of an implied argument, implied syllogisms behind there, and then the presentational one, which is what they state more explicitly. And so, you know, when you're writing something, there are hundreds and thousands of things that you can say and that you're thinking, but the writing itself is just selected of a few things that you're saying. And so those things are being brought into the presence of your audience. And not only are those things brought into the presence, and then other things that are sort of not present, but you know, if there are 16 kind of points that you're making or things that are going on, some are going to be more present than others. So this idea of presence is of, you know, of just, well, where the music swells kind of thing, where, you know, you get this, your whole self being paying attention. We see this in a lot with these inspirational orations, but you can talk about it too with everyday things. That is, what is really important, and how is the organization drawing your attention to what's important? So they did give this example in the textbook of this Think Small commercial. I think I'll just go up here and look at it rather than oh, maybe I don't have it anymore.
This year, just about everyone's coming out with a brand new small car.
Let me make sure it's loud enough. Can you guys hear?
I heard it a little bit. It was a little quiet.
Yeah. Okay, let's try that.
This year, just about everyone's coming out with a brand new small car. So this year, just about everyone will be telling you about this great new idea, to think small. It is a great idea. We at Volkswagen have been working on it for 21 years.
So this is a great ad for talking about how the movement in a piece of rhetoric might be from absence to presence. The ad starts with this blank white, well, not completely blank, but a big white page that says think small. So what was going on in your mind when you saw think small?
Well, it's kind of the opposite of the common saying of like, think big, like big ideas, I guess. I don't know.
That's true. So it's sort of a surprise why you do that. What else?
To me, I didn't really know how to respond to that.
Just about everyone's coming out with a brand new small car. So this year, just about everyone will be telling you about this great new.
So this is all you see for most of this is only a 30-second clip ad. It came out in the early 80s, apparently. And it appears to me that somebody must have recorded it off a TV or something. The quality is so poor. But so we're into 13
New
seconds.
idea. To think small. It is a great idea.
All right, so at about the exactly halfway, we finally have something on this big white space. So what were you thinking about while you saw all this white space?
It's like they're messing with us, like trying to be provocative in some sort of annoying way.
Yeah, that I wonder if that's a not quite what they want. they're definitely trying to encourage you to think about something. And the fact that there's this blank page, causes you to either be annoyed or wonder what's going to happen. You assume something will happen.
It made me think of a piece of paper with a toy car like slowly like being like pushed onto the piece of paper. I don't know.
So at 22 seconds in, we have a car. It's from the top. And do you see what's on the bottom here in the picture?
Was that a ladybug?
No, it's a person.
Oh, I'm sorry. I told you I couldn't see very well.
It's a person, but that's, why are they doing this from the top? Is the question that I have.
It's like a bird's eye view. Because birds can, I mean, they're flying up and everything looks smaller.
Oh, yeah. So he comes in. Oh, it's two people. On the bottom, it's two people carrying something. They put it down and walk away. And over there, there's a person who
Have been working on it for 21 years.
Oh, I know what this is. This is the VW logo.
Oh, okay. That's what I thought was the ladybug.
Yeah. So it's two people in like lab coats, scientists, and then they put down a VW logo. And then we have this. What a weird collection of things on my screen. So they definitely, and their goal is obviously to engage your mind with their form. And in this case, because it's a video, it is a moving form. And so it sort of forces you into their form.
Yeah.
Even more than written text would. And it basically goes from absence to presence, from absence, and you're like, how is this going to relate to VW? You probably don't even know that it's VW until you put the commercial thing down. And I'm not sure you can ever tell that it's a VW because it's from the top. But the result of that is that once that VW gets there and they say, VW has been doing this for 21 years, which is how long the Volkswagen Beetle has been around. they bring your attention to that, you know, the expertise of VW with the small car. So this was in the early 80s when they were just beginning to, well, maybe not just beginning, but there had been a attempt within the last 4, 5, 6 years to start moving cars towards something smaller that would use less gas. And now we're so used to smaller cars, we may not remember, although we now also are used to gigantic SUVs, so it's different. But there was a movement towards the small thing. Additionally, they're drawing on your sense of what other companies are doing and then comparing themselves to them by being the experts. I hope you didn't mind having to watch a video on Monday.
What, the Mayor Landrieu video?
Yeah, yeah.
No, that was a great assignment. I really enjoyed that.
You know, when I'm looking for these speeches, to tell you the truth, what I tend to do is what I'm trying to find is something short enough that can work in a class. And
Yeah.
So that it turned out to be a great one.
Yeah, that was a great.
You know, I really didn't know very much about Mayor Landrieu. I don't know.
I didn't either.
In my text, I had actually given you a link to him. It's, I think it's in here. No. I guess it was, I'm not sure where it was. Oh, I know where it was. It's in the announcements. So when he retired from being mayor, he created this organization called E Pluribus Unum, which is from our national motto, out of many one. And he wrote a book called A White Southerner Confronts History. In the Shadow of Statues, A White Southerner Confronts History. And, you know, he's got doing a lot of interesting projects to try to promote conversation, basically, about changing Southern viewpoints about it.
Yeah.
And it's an educational group as well. They have webinars. I thought that was pretty interesting. So it also turned out to be a good speech for talking about the classical template because he followed it. And really, I find that editorials and speeches almost always follow the classical template more or less. Now, I'll say more or less because the whole point about the template is that it's flexible, and it needs to be flexible because the audiences are different. And I mean, one of the things that everybody always will say about any of these things is you adapt to the audience. And it's really useful, I think. I think it's fun to learn the Latin terms, but if the Latin terms get in the way of your understanding, just use the English explanations. So an exordium is the introduction or insinuation. I'll talk about the two types. The same root as the English word exhort is in exordium. What does exhort mean in English?
It means sort of like to plead.
Plead, to sort of strongly urge somebody to do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
But basically it's an introduction. And then narration is basically background or history or background or you know, situation. There's an interesting table in the book where certain other kinds of structures are matched against the classical structure. Is anybody in grant writing? Or
Not
taking-
yet.
Not yet. So on page 118, there is a table where the classical template is matched against other genres. And the third one it matches against is the proposal, or which you will learn about in grant writing, or you could learn in many other kinds of assignments. But almost every grant call for proposals will say that there has to be a background or a narrative section. That is, you know, what is it that led to whatever the proposal is? What is the problem that you're seeking to solve? And so that's always going to be in there. The third section is sometimes called the division, sometimes called the partition, which basically mean the same thing. And that's more or less a preview or forecast of what is to follow. The confirmation, which is definitely a term that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, are the actual arguments. That's the real body of the argument in it. Refutation is dealing with objections, and it's if you've dealt, well, we talked about Toulmin, and remember that Toulmin included refutation or rebuttal as part of his argument. And it may be counterintuitive to some people, but in general, thinking about counter arguments is a way to strengthen your own argument, so that thinking about counter arguments in advance will help you develop and strengthen whatever you're trying to argue. And you often see it actually in the text. That is, people, you know, some kind of section where it says, some people say blah, 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 blah. And then you respond to those objections. And then the peroration or the conclusion, which somehow brings it all together. I have a little note down here. I put that here to remind myself to say this, that I think the classical template is a great way of helping you figure out what you want to say. In other words, it's a pre-writing strategy, because sometimes it's hard, you know, you've got lots and lots of ideas, but you're not really sure what you want to say. That little structure just kind of gives you a way of thinking through some of the things that you might say about whatever the topic is. And so if you're ever at a loss for trying to understand what's going on, you know, how to write something, you know, consider using these as sort of pre-writing terms. A lot of what we've talked about can be used for pre-writing, even if you don't use it in the end for the presentational argument. So in the quizzes, I asked people to say have a question, and several people asked about insinuation. And lo and behold, I noticed that today's editorial actually was an example of insinuation. And as it turned out, the editorial can be analyzed, broken down into a classical template. So I thought we could take a look at that. What does insinuation mean? Well, basically the point that Cicero makes is that there are two kinds of exordiums, and and they're basically roughly divided to whether you feel like your audience can take us, kind of will agree with you and is an open audience versus an audience that might not agree with you. And the idea of the insinuation is that you try to kind of move slowly into the point, bringing the audience with their other points of view over into your point of view.
That's what I thought that Mayor Landry was really masterful at in his speech.
Yes.
He had a big challenge in front of him to get a lot of people to let go of some of these old ideas and old traditions that were so resistant to change.
Yes. Let's see, I'm trying to find where Cicero actually says this. So at 15, he starts by explaining what an exordium is. It brings the mind of the hearer into a suitable state to receive the rest of the speech. And that will be effective if it's rendered him well disposed toward the speaker, attentive and willing to receive information. Now, the thing about Cicero, what he's doing is this textbook, what they used to call technical rhetoric. He back in the time of this, you know, there weren't that many subjects of study in the education of people. And one of the subjects of study, though, was of rhetoric and of learning how to do a speech. And they were teaching people every kind of speech possible and every kind of circumstance possible. And so it's difficult. Cicero is sort of a not necessarily something that a lot of people like to read now because it's got so much in it. But every once in a while, he'll say these things that are just very helpful. And I guess I can't find the insinuation versus direction thing where he says.
It's buried in there somewhere, isn't it?
It is buried, and that's the kind of the problem of it. But
Yeah.
let's take a look at this example. So first of all, okay, message in a bottle. This is today's editorial, the main editorial. Editorials are always very much tied to the moment. Editorial, you know, the editorial committee at the newspaper, they sit down and they say, well, you know, what's the most important topic that we should write an opinion about at this moment? And actually what happened today is pretty much everybody, every editorial and op-ed today was about the law that was passed in Georgia. So you got to hand it to the Republican Party. There doesn't seem to be any easy, worthwhile task that the GOP can't turn into a difficult one that provides the opposing party with what the military calls a target-rich environment. Republican captains will steer a piece of legislation through currents and eddies, and just before sailing into port with a winner, will add offhand some little phrase or item or sentence that will not only act as an anchor on everything, including the news cycle, but will give late night comics a week's worth of jokes. Now, first of all, I'm a reader of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I know that they are very much a Republican leaning newspaper, maybe even far right Republican leaning newspaper. So it is a little bit surprising for me to read a negative thing about the Republican Party, showing them as managing to always screw things up and become the butt of late night jokes. And so they are basically sort of appealing to me a little. I almost never agree with Arkansas Democrat Gazette editorials. But I'm thinking, well, maybe they're kind of, seeing some of the problems in the choices of the Republican Party. For example, in Georgia, you can't give a bottle of water to a voter waiting in line. Now, there's a perfect example of setting up a kind of a mystery, wondering what. And then it says, that's a distortion of the truth, of course, but it's a line that fell into the opposition's lap. The newly signed voter ID legislation in Georgia was amended to keep folks like candidates, unions, the NRA from approaching a line of voters with signs and t-shirts and opinions to hand out water while accidentally doing a little electioneering. Water can be provided on site by the precinct itself. Personally, I wish all those people would not be allowed to campaign right at the election booth. It kind of bugs me, but instead of debating voter ID laws, the news columns are filled with this. It's worse than Jim Crow, Derek Bozeman, a community leader in Georgia, told the press. This bill would make it criminal to pass out a bottle of water to some old lady who had to stand in line. Republican PR takes another hit. The great bottled water debate aside, is the new law in Georgia really worse than Jim Crow? You know what? I think I would probably say, I'd say the narration starts there. Because basically all of this whole little episode at the beginning is, kind of making fun of the Republican Party that somehow ended up passing this new law, and somehow it became into, you can't pass out water. The Republican PR takes another hit, and that has a nice ring of closure. The great bottled water debate aside, is the new law in Georgia really worse than Jim Crow? So here we have narration, which is background. And here's some more information. President Joe Biden called Georgia's new law Jim Crow in the 21st century. He actually called it Jim Eagle. Younger Democrats have used the phrase Jim Crow 2.0. Opposition in Georgia and the rest of the country is on the attack. And Republicans once again find themselves floundering in the channel, hoping the winds shift. Georgia's new voter ID law is hell and gone from Jim Crow. That means it's far away. It's not like Jim Crow. These post-Civil War, pre-Civil Rights Act state law. So first we have some background about, how people are responding to it now. Now we have background about Jim Crow. These post-Civil War, pre-Civil Rights Act state laws enforce racial segregation, disenfranchised Black voters. The law was used to keep Black people from serving on juries. Schools were separately and definitely not equal. Those who complain about that anything happening today is Jim Crow 2.0 really need to take a high school American history course or read something, preferably a book. or perhaps they could read a new law. That's part of the genre of the editorial, is to make snarky comments like that. Perhaps they could read the new law. It does make some changes, including, so we're in the terms of background, first we're getting background in terms of the public response, particularly the criticism of it. Then we're getting background on what Jim Crow is, their definition. And now we're getting a very concrete, specific background. This is what the law says. It requires a photo ID, and note they put a little comment. There's nothing Jim Crow about requiring a photo or state issued ID to vote by absentee ballot, Kemp said. Every Georgia voter must already do so when voting in person. The law reduces the number of ballot drop box locations. I think they just slipped that in to try to make it sound, saying, because they're trying to say that these are all reasonable things. That is definitely not reasonable. It reduces the time between general and runoff elections. It expands early voting. It allows every voter the ability to request a mail-in ballot without a reason. And it also gives lawmakers new powers over elections. Critics point to worst case scenarios in which a Republican legislature in the state would take over for local election boards. Now that's a debate with some meat on it. How much would the fringe part of the party have changed things electorally in 2020 if the law had been in effect then? None at all, everything at all, and how will the courts rule? Because you just know how this is going to court. So all this is background or narration to what they're going to say, which is their opinion about the new law in Georgia that was passed yesterday, which is why it's part of the Kairos. And I'm sure most major newspapers have editorials about it. Division. So division is the section that is basically the preview. That seems like the discussion Georgia and the rest of America should be having, which is, what will this law do? Not, is this an example of racism, but what exactly will this law do to society? And they don't think anything, actually. Then the next section is confirmation or proof. And here's their basic argument. Some of us think it should be every bit as difficult to vote as it is to write a check at the grocery store. All the stuff about why voter ID is not racist is just wonderful, or it's just parallel with what's asked for in other situations. And predictions about the effects of the law are simply baseless. Those arguing against voter IDs by comparing these changes to Jim Crow might have to eat crow if that comment was in the lead. Instead, we get the great bottled water debate in comparisons to the South in the 1890s. So basically, he's refuting the people criticizing the law by saying, it's kind of an indirect thing, which is why it's an insinuation, that if only all the media and the Republicans focused on the content, not this trivial thing about water bottles, then they'd be able to make their case. And then his peroration, just very simple, their peroration, come let us reason together. So basically, an introduction, according to Cicero, is a direct introduction where you don't feel like your audience will disagree with you, whereas an insinuation is an indirect introduction where you try to identify with the objectors and sort of bring them along with you. There was another question about partition. And Cicero says there are two kinds of partitions. And I think it's kind of helpful. One part or type is that which points out which are the particulars as to which one is in agreement with the opposite party and also what remains in dispute. And from this, there's a certain definite thing pointed out to be to the hearer as to that which he should direct his attention. So in thinking about that sort of movement from given to new, he's saying that this point where you are sort of forecasting what's about to happen in the rest of the speech or writing or whatever, you are bringing your audience along and showing where we're all in agreement, and then pointing out the part where we're in disagreement, which kind of focuses our attention, brings presence to what we're really going to focus on. The other part is that in which the explanation of those matters, this translation translates this as part, but other translations translate it as type. The other type is that in which the explanation of those matters on which we are about to speak is briefly arranged and pointed out. It's your basic tell them what you're going to tell them kind of statement. Another question that people had was about confirmation. And you see that in section 24. And he talks about probable and unavoidable. And really this is Cicero's discussion of argumentation. Confirmation is that by means of which our speech preceding an argument adds belief in authority and corroboration to our cause. And then at 29, they say, but all argumentation which can be derived from those topics which we have mentioned ought to be either probable or unavoidable. Indeed, to Vinan, in a few words, argumentation appears to be an invention of some sort, which either shows something or other in a probable manner or demonstrates it as an irrefutable one. So basically it's his talking about basically the logic of an argument. If it's irrefutable, then the logic that you're showing, you may be able to use syllogistic logic more readily, is that this is the only way you can conclude. Whereas probable is where you're providing a little bit more doubt. And it's interesting because it also connects back with Toulmin. And if you recall the qualifier term in Toulmin, where with claims, you know, often you have to qualify the claim that you're making. So here's a summary of the different types of structure that are discussed in this chapter. There is a progressive type, and there is there are two types of that. So a progressive type basically moves from one place to another. You have a sense in listening or reading or watching or whatever that you are progressing from one place to the next. And there are two basic types that Kenneth Burke, who's they're relying on, talk about. One is the syllogistic, which may be logical, or at least it feels logical. You feel like each section follows logically from the next. And if you're doing something very analytical, that would definitely be the way to go. The classical template is very logical. It's like, here's something that's interesting, here's the background. The next thing logically to talk about is, what the problem is, and then what my arguments are. And so it's very logical, sort of lockstep kind of approach. A qualitative argument still does have a sense of progression, but it's more associative and emotional. And it may be more appropriate perhaps for talking about not speeches, but music or games or whatever. And then the repetitive structure, the example I gave last class was the speech that Steve Jobs did that you saw in the quiz. That is that where basically his structure was three main parts, each of them being an incident that illustrated his main point. So he didn't move from one point to the next so much as make a point and then reiterate the point and then reiterate the point. And it's kind of like enlarging circles as he sort of strengthened that point of, follow your own desire. One, I think that's really interesting, those of you who have taken any of the document design or usability courses, this is definitely a much more modern issue of how do you design things, visuals, websites, plain written documents, so that they are usable and so that people can access them. And the textbook gives the example of the reference guide, the manual, which loosely is rhetorical in the sense that it's persuading you to use whatever manual it's for. But the structure is, so it's organized by chapters. You don't read it in the order of the chapters, you read it in the order of how you need to use it. And so how can you set up a structure so that it's easy to access the information that you know? I mean, the prototypical reference guide is the dictionary, which is organized alphabetically so that so that you can easily access the information that's in there. Even that one you could talk about the psychology of form, of creating expectations and confirming those expectations, because you have a question, you want to find out how to spell something or the history of something, and then you easily access it by using the alphabet, and then your expectations are satisfied once you find the answer to that. But when you start getting at more complicated reference guides, and then once we get into the world of websites, it's a big question of how do you structure it so that it's easy for somebody to access it and find what they need to. And we definitely have seen over the years changes in how websites are designed, all designed to make it more easy for us to access them. And then the authors kind of question whether video games have structure, but I think they probably do. And I think you might think about dynamic or interactive structures that are not stable, that are designed to be changeable and to be interactive, in which you get to create some of the structure when you make choices along the way. So right now, I'm going to ask you to use the chat. And what I'd like you to chat about is what structure the piece of rhetoric that you're analyzing uses. How could you describe the structure? So Anna, what do you mean by it's qualitative? Do it in the chat so we have a record. Interesting. Are all games set up as in the quests order structure?
Not all of them. I mean, some are maybe more exploratory, or maybe there's not really quests at all.
So Jay, are you saying that your speech is a follows, or the letter to Baldwin's nephew follows a classical template?
I think it does in many respects. There's constant partitioning, but it comes back around. It's sort of cyclic. It partitions and then it brings it back together, and then it partitions again and brings it back together. Did you need me to type all that in the chat?
Nah. but
Because I'm using two thumbs. Two fat thumbs.
Aaliyah, how would you describe the structure of Beyonce's Lemonade, the album, or particular songs, or the movie? I wasn't sure whether you were going to do the movie or the.
Well, it's a visual album, so it's kind of like, I don't know how to explain that. It's like both. It's like both
Mhm.
the album and the visual, like it's a film, but it's also an album. I don't know how to explain it.
It's sort of an unusual genre, isn't it?
Yeah, because it's like a film and an album into one. So it's like together. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's multimedia. Would be
Yeah,
the
that.
term.
That's actually a very good one.
So, you know, the technology that's available these days allows so many multimedia or multimodal
Mhm.
opportunities. Talia, are you doing all anime?
All,
A particular
all what?
anime?
Did you
All,
say? Sorry.
no, I said to Talia. She said, I'm
Oh,
doing anime,
sorry.
so it's very broad. Is it a particular anime? So Naruto. So how is it structured? Is this static comic or video, or video cartoons, I guess? I guess the question is graphic versus video anime. Animated. Okay, animated, that would be. Okay, so we have run out of time. But thinking about structure is really interesting, especially once we, whether we're talking about very traditional kinds of pieces of rhetoric or, all these new types of rhetoric available in our popular culture. So it'll be interesting to see what y'all come up with. Let me just finish. To remind everybody of homework. So apply the ideas of structure to one of the blogs by April 5th. Quiz starts tomorrow, and we'll start working on style next week.
Sounds good.
Any questions? Bye.
Take care. See you soon.